I never imagined that Liberty Island would become our final refuge, nor that I would find myself scanning the dark, churning waters around her with nothing but a pair of binoculars and a thin glimmer of hope. It was our last stand, our quiet desperation embodied in the silent statue towering above us, one arm raised high, her torch a symbol of defiance against the darkness sweeping the world. But as we stared out, our nerves frayed and patience worn thin, it was clear she couldn't save us from what was coming. We'd been holed up here for a week, each day feeling longer than the last. Our camp was a sad excuse for sanctuary. Makeshift tents strung along the base, supplies dwindling, and spirits barely holding. Food was running low, and water was rationed down to a trickle. We shared looks more than words, our faces drawn with a fatigue too heavy to articulate. The radio crackled once every few hours, static blending with the distant thunder that warned of an incoming storm. I clung to that radio like it was a lifeline, hoping to hear something, anything that hinted at rescue. The coast was a distant memory now, a hazy line of city towers swallowed by shadow and silence. We didn't speak much of what had happened, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. The world we'd known was gone, and every night I looked to the mainland, wondering if there was anything left worth returning to. One evening, just as the last sliver of daylight slipped below the horizon, I caught sight of something moving in the water. At first, I told myself it was the usual debris, driftwood or scraps of refuse, but then I saw it again. A dark mass, slow and deliberate, inching its way toward us. The tide had brought them in close before, but never like this. And in the flickering light from our meager lanterns, I realized with a sinking feeling that this time was different. They were coming in larger numbers, relentless, their forms pressing toward the island with unnatural patience. I didn't say anything at first. Maybe it was fear, or maybe just a desperate hope that, by ignoring it, I could make it go away. But as the mass of bodies drew closer, I knew that we couldn't stay silent anymore. It was our last shot to regroup, prepare, and somehow muster the strength to survive the night. Around me, others had started to notice. The quiet gasps, the nervous shifting. Everyone understood the stakes without needing words. I caught the eye of Marco, the closest thing we had to a leader. His face was hard, unreadable, but in his eyes, I saw the same dread mirrored back at me. We gathered around Marco as he studied the distant figures, his jaw tight and eyes fixed, calculating. He didn't waste words. He just motioned for everyone to start barricading and bolstering what little we had. A weak assortment of rope, makeshift spears, anything we could find on the island. Each of us was left to our own devices, repurposing fragments of this historical monument as tools for survival. The storm was closing in fast, dark clouds swallowing the sky. A heavy wind whipped around us, rattling our tents, almost drowning out the unsettling groans that started to drift across the water. The groans weren't exactly human, more like empty shells straining under the weight of something deeper, something I didn't dare to put a name to. And the closer they came, the more that sound filled the space between us, chipping away at the resolve that kept us grounded. I found myself stationed near the lower base, clutching an old metal rod I'd pried from a railing earlier. It wasn't much, but it was something solid. For a moment, I caught my reflection in one of the memorial plaques, the face staring back almost unrecognizable, gaunt, haunted. I looked away quickly, forcing myself to focus on the immediate task at hand. Above us, the Statue of Liberty loomed, her green copper form seeming to blend into the storm clouds, her face shadowed and indifferent. She had witnessed countless events in her time, stood as a symbol through wars, revolutions, and calamities. But now she stood alone, isolated, her towering presence a reminder of a world that no longer seemed to exist. The first of them touched shore as the rain started to fall. The sound of their feet squelching through the sand filled the air, somehow louder than the storm itself. I felt my stomach drop as I saw them up close, their features obscured by the rain but undeniably altered, twisted. They moved with a strange sense of purpose, not quite fast, but relentless, steady, as though they had all the time in the world. There was no time for a plan. Marco barked orders, sending a few of us to the higher levels and positioning the rest along the base. The idea was to force them into a bottleneck, make it difficult for them to swarm us all at once. It was a slim chance, but it was all we had. As they drew closer, I took up my position and gripped the metal rod tighter, my knuckles white. Every instinct told me to run, to find some hidden corner and wait it out. But there was nowhere to go. The island was surrounded. The waters were filled with more of them drifting toward us, and the storm had turned violent, as if nature itself was closing in on us. I glanced up at the statue again, hoping for some ridiculous burst of inspiration, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on the distant shore as though she, too, was indifferent to our struggle. The rain poured down in torrents, a cold, hammering wall of water that soaked us to the bone and turned the ground beneath our feet into a slick, treacherous mess. Visibility was nearly zero, but we could still make out the approaching forms, figures moving methodically through the storm, unfazed by the elements, locked on us like they had nothing else left to care about. As the first one reached the edge of the statue's base, Marco signaled, and we all braced for impact. My grip on the metal rod tightened, and I felt every muscle in my body coil with anticipation. I'd never had to use it on anything before. I had no idea what it would feel like, what kind of force would be required. But I couldn't think about that now. One deep breath, and I forced myself to focus. The figure lurched into view, just a few feet away. Rainwater dripped from its slackened face, empty eyes that stared forward with a blank determination. Its clothes were soaked and tattered, hanging from a frame that had clearly seen better days. In that moment, I was struck by a strange, surreal thought. This had been someone once, a person with dreams, memories, a life. But that thought slipped away as quickly as it came, overridden by the reality that this thing was here to take ours. It stumbled toward me, arms outstretched, and before I even realized what I was doing, I swung the rod. The impact jolted up my arm, harder than I'd expected, but the figure staggered back, momentarily thrown off balance. That small victory gave me a rush, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could hold them back. But that glimmer vanished as more of them emerged from the rain, closing in, each step a reminder of how little time we had. Behind me, I heard a scream. Someone wasn't quick enough. Someone hadn't expected the sheer force of these things. I forced myself not to look, to keep my focus forward. We had to stay in line, keep the barricade steady. If we broke formation now, we'd lose any chance of holding our ground. "Keep them at the stairs," Marco yelled, his voice barely audible over the storm. His eyes were hard, focused, his hands gripping a makeshift club that looked like it had been ripped from a piece of scaffolding. He swung it with precision, driving one of them back, its form crumpling under the blow. But for each one we pushed back, two more seemed to appear, stumbling out of the darkness as if drawn by some silent call. It felt like hours passed in those first minutes. Every swing, every step, every breath was a struggle against the tide. The cold rain soaked through my clothes, sapping my strength, numbing my hands, but I couldn't stop. There was no room for weakness, no time to question if I could keep going. Survival was all that mattered. Somewhere in the chaos, I heard Marco shout again, his voice tinged with something I hadn't heard from him before: panic. I turned just in time to see one of them break through the line, slipping past us and heading toward the tents, where our supplies and the injured were sheltered. "No!" I shouted, more to myself than anyone else. But it was too late. The figure was already disappearing into the shadows, and I knew what it meant. Once they were inside, our last refuge would become a trap, a cage with no way out. I swung again, forcing another figure back, but the realization settled in, heavy and unshakable. This wasn't just a skirmish. This was a siege. And unless something changed, unless we found a way to push them back, we wouldn't see the morning. The storm hit us in full force, rain slashing across our faces like shards of glass, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the horde for a split second. The dark, twisted figures shuffling relentlessly toward us, their movements jerky and disjointed, but with an eerie, mechanical determination that sent chills down my spine. Marco yelled at us to reform the line, his voice cutting through the chaos. He was right. We were starting to drift, each of us being pushed back by the unyielding pressure of the oncoming wave. It wasn't just the sheer number of them. It was the way they seemed to absorb every blow without slowing, like they felt no pain, no exhaustion. They were empty shells, driven by something beyond human endurance, and every instinct I had screamed that we were fighting a losing battle. As the rain poured harder, visibility dropped even further, making it difficult to tell friend from foe. Somewhere to my left, I heard the sound of a struggle, a low grunt followed by the sickening thud of a body hitting the ground. I clenched the metal rod in my hand and forced myself to stay focused. I couldn't afford to let fear cloud my thoughts. I took a deep breath, scanning the base of the statue for any sign of weakness. We needed a plan, a way to funnel them into a narrow space where we could fight them off one at a time. But with the storm raging around us and our makeshift barricade buckling under the weight of their attack, it was hard to think, hard to breathe. Beside me, Marco was swinging his club, his movements precise and controlled. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. I could see in his eyes that he'd accepted what was happening, that he understood better than any of us what we were really up against. This wasn't a fight we could win through strength alone. It was a test of endurance, of grit, of willpower. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air, louder than thunder, echoing through the storm. I turned to see one of the barricades give way, the wooden beams snapping under the pressure as the infected pushed through with renewed force. My heart dropped. The breach was small, but it was enough. They poured in like water through a dam, filling the space we'd fought so hard to defend. Panic rippled through the group, a chain reaction that spread faster than fire. Some of us backed away, retreating to higher ground, while others tried to plug the gap, their faces set in grim determination. I hesitated, torn between holding my ground and falling back, but I knew that if we didn't contain the breach, it was over. Marco was already there, his eyes blazing with a mix of fear and fury as he swung his club with renewed vigor, trying to stem the tide. "Hold the line," he shouted, his voice hoarse and ragged. "If we lose this position, we're done." I forced myself forward, stepping into the breach beside him. The infected were close now, close enough that I could see the vacant look in their eyes, the pale, mottled skin stretched tight over their faces. I tried not to look too closely, tried not to think about what they'd once been. In that moment, they were nothing but obstacles, barriers to survival. I swung my rod with everything I had, feeling the impact reverberate up my arm. It was a strange sensation, part numbness, part adrenaline. Every blow felt like it was draining me, pulling some essential part of me away with each swing. But I couldn't stop. If I stopped, if I faltered for even a second, it would all be over. Somewhere behind us, a voice called out. A woman's voice, sharp and desperate. They're inside. They've broken through the tents. The words hit like a physical blow, and I felt a surge of dread settle in my stomach. Marco glanced at me, a brief flicker of helplessness crossing his face before he steeled himself. "Get up there," he said, his voice low and firm. "Protect the others. I'll hold them here." I opened my mouth to protest, but the look in his eyes silenced me. This was his decision, his sacrifice. With a reluctant nod, I turned and scrambled up the steps, my heart pounding as I raced toward the tents. The thought of what I might find there filled me with a kind of hollow dread, but I forced it down, focused on putting one foot in front of the other. As I reached the tents, the scene before me was chaos. The infected had torn through the fabric, their bodies silhouetted against the dim light as they moved through the camp, searching, hunting. I could see our people scattering, some trying to hide, others frozen in terror. I knew I had to act fast, had to find some way to rally them, to give them a fighting chance. But as I stood there, watching the horror unfold, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only delaying the inevitable, that no matter how hard we fought, no matter how many we took down, we were only postponing the end. In that moment, with the storm raging around us and the infected closing in from all sides, survival felt like a distant memory, a faint echo of something we'd once believed in. Now it was just a word, hollow and meaningless in the face of what was coming. And yet, even as that thought settled over me, I knew I couldn't give up. Not yet. I barely felt my feet hitting the ground as I ran through the maze of shredded tents and broken supplies, scanning for any sign of survivors. The storm had swallowed up all other sounds, making it feel as if we were fighting alone in a dark, endless void. There was no going back to the barricades, and with every step, the enormity of our situation became clearer. Each flash of lightning revealed silhouettes shambling toward us, closer than the last, moving with that haunting, tireless persistence. I found Leah crouched near the base of a fallen tent pole, her face streaked with rain and dirt. She clutched a length of pipe in her hands, her eyes darting between me and the infected staggering closer. She was young, barely out of her teens, and I could see the sheer terror in her expression. But there was something else too, a spark of determination, a flicker of defiance against the crushing fear. "Leah, we need to move," I shouted, barely able to hear my own voice over the howling wind. I reached out, pulling her up and glancing over my shoulder at the figures closing in. "We have to get to higher ground." We scrambled up the narrow metal stairway leading to the statue's pedestal, gripping the wet, slippery railings as the storm tore at us. Every step felt like a struggle against gravity, against the weight of despair pressing down on us. Behind us, I could hear the infected scraping at the metal, relentless in their pursuit. When we reached the top, we found a handful of others huddled near the pedestal's edge, eyes wide and faces pale. I counted 6 of us, including Marco, who had somehow managed to hold the barricade long enough to make it back. His face was streaked with cuts, his clothes torn, but he was still standing, still holding his ground. As we gathered together, The realization sank in. This was all that remained. Everyone else was gone, lost in the chaos below. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut, and I forced myself to push it aside. There was no time to mourn, no time to dwell on what we'd lost. All we had now was each other, and whatever slim chance we had left. Marco looked at each of us, his expression grim but resolute. "We can't hold this spot forever," he said, his voice steady. "If they keep coming like this, it's only a matter of time." Leah clutched her pipe tighter, her knuckles white. "Then what do we do?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. "We can't go back down there. They'll tear us apart." Marco's gaze shifted to the crown of the statue, looming above us like a silent sentinel. "There's one place they haven't breached yet," he said slowly. "The crown. It's narrow, too narrow for a large group to come at us all at once. If we can make it up there, we might have a chance to pick them off." It was a desperate plan, but it was the only plan we had. With a nod, we made our way toward the inner staircase, our footsteps echoing in the hollow space as we climbed. The narrowness of the passage was both a blessing and a curse. It would slow the infected, but it also meant we had no room to maneuver, no space to escape if they broke through. As we ascended, the air grew stale and heavy, filled with the metallic scent of rust and damp stone. Each step felt like a journey deeper into the unknown, as if we were leaving the world behind and entering a realm of shadows and silence. The only sounds were our ragged breaths and the faint creak of the stairs beneath us. When we reached the crown, we huddled together, peering out through the narrow windows that overlooked the storm-lashed harbor. The infected were swarming below, their forms barely visible in the rain. But we could see the way they moved, drawn to the base of the statue like moths to a flame. It was as if they sensed our presence, as if some primal instinct was guiding them, pulling them toward us with a hunger that defied all reason. Marco leaned against the wall, his face set in grim determination. "We're not going down without a fight," he said, his voice low and fierce. "Whatever happens, we hold this spot. We make our stand here." One by one, we each nodded, clutching our makeshift weapons as we prepared for the onslaught. There was no escape, no rescue on the horizon. We were alone, cut off from the world, facing an enemy that wouldn't rest, wouldn't stop until we were gone. And yet, in that moment, I felt a strange sense of clarity, a calmness that settled over me like a protective shield. This was our last stand, our final battle. And as I looked into the eyes of those around me, I knew that we would fight with everything we had, not for survival, but for the hope that we could make a difference. That in some small way our struggle would mean something, that our last moments would be a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The infected were coming, closer with every heartbeat, their shadows stretching up the staircase like fingers reaching for us. And as we stood there, side by side, waiting for the inevitable, I knew that whatever happened next, we would face it together. We barely had time to brace ourselves. The infected started pouring into the narrow staircase below, their ragged limbs clawing up each step with that eerie, unnatural persistence. The narrow ascent slowed them down, but only just. I watched as their silhouettes staggered, arms outstretched, reaching up toward us with every ounce of tenacity that their altered bodies could muster. Marco took point, positioning himself near the mouth of the staircase with a broken metal rod he'd scavenged earlier. Leah and I flanked him, our makeshift weapons raised, every nerve in our bodies buzzing. There was no turning back now. The only option was to hold them off step by brutal step until we could hold out no longer. The first infected reached the top of the staircase, lunging toward Marco. He swung the rod with a fierce precision, catching it squarely across the chest and sending it tumbling back into the throng below. But for each one that fell, two more seemed to take its place, driven by a relentless energy that refused to die. The rain beat against the windows of the crown, each drop like a ticking clock counting down our time. The storm was relentless, casting shadows through the small, narrow panes, warping the outside world into something twisted and unreal. Every time I looked out, the image was the same. A dark, angry ocean thrashing against the statue's base, encircling us in a watery prison. As the infected pressed closer, our strategy became survival by inches. Marco swung with a ferocity I hadn't seen before, but his movements were slowing, each swing taking a toll on his already exhausted body. Leah fought with a quiet determination, her gaze fixed, her face set in grim focus. Her pipe collided with one after another, and yet they kept coming, stumbling over their fallen companions, driven by that same blind need. After what felt like hours, Marco's rod finally gave way, snapping in half as it caught against the edge of the stairwell. He cursed under his breath, throwing the useless metal aside and grabbing a heavy piece of debris as a last-ditch weapon. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the strain in his shoulders, but he wasn't about to give up. None of us were. In the brief lull between attacks, we backed up against the inner wall of the crown, gasping for breath, exchanging looks of steely resolve. The infected were still crowding the stairs, but the narrow passage had slowed their advance, giving us precious moments to regroup. "We're not going to hold them off forever," Leah said, her voice barely above a murmur. Her eyes were wide, scanning the perimeter as if searching for any hint of an escape. Marco shook his head. "We don't need forever. Just long enough." Long enough for what? I found myself asking, my voice raw with the weight of everything we'd seen. He met my gaze, his expression unreadable. "Long enough to leave a mark," he said. "They may take us down, but we'll make them remember we didn't go quietly." In that moment, something shifted in the air. A sense of unity, of shared purpose that made the dread retreat, if only for a fleeting second. This was the end of the line, but we would make it count. Another flash of lightning illuminated the crown, and in that brief, blinding light, I caught a glimpse of the horde pressing up the stairs, a writhing, relentless tide that wouldn't stop until we were overrun. And then, just as quickly, the light was gone, replaced by the storm's darkness, as if nature itself was sealing us into our final moments. With renewed resolve, we resumed our positions, gripping our makeshift weapons with white-knuckled determination. The infected were closing in, their broken bodies dragging up the last few steps. It was as if the storm outside was fueling their advance, the wind howling through the crown, echoing around us like a relentless, mocking chant. They broke through in a sudden surge, and the fight turned desperate. I swung my weapon wildly, feeling the impact reverberate through my arms with each blow. Marco fought beside me, his every movement an act of defiance against the unyielding horde. And Leah, quiet, determined Leah, stood her ground, her strikes fierce, her resolve unbreakable. It wasn't long before the fatigue set in, slowing our reactions, sapping our strength. The infected were everywhere now, their limbs reaching, clutching, their presence a suffocating mass. I felt my grip slipping, my vision blurring, and for a moment, the darkness closed in. But as I staggered back, something unexpected happened. A distant, faint sound pierced the storm, cutting through the chaos. It was a mechanical hum, a low, steady thrum growing louder by the second. I blinked, forcing myself to focus, unsure if I was hearing it at all, or if my mind was playing tricks. Then, through the rain-streaked window, I caught a glimpse of lights in the distance. Headlights, cutting through the storm's veil, drawing closer to the island. We froze, caught between the merciless advance of the infected and the shock of what we were seeing. A boat, coming straight toward Liberty Island, its twin beams slicing through the rain and darkness. The light was both surreal and jarring, a fragile promise of escape in the middle of a nightmare. My mind struggled to reconcile it. After days of isolation, of despair creeping in, seeing something as ordinary as a set of headlights felt almost impossible. Marco was the first to snap out of it, his face twisting with a mix of disbelief and hope. "Get to the windows," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. We moved as one, scrambling to the small, narrow panes, pressing our faces against the cold glass as we peered out. There, through the sheets of rain, we could make out the shape of a boat, a sturdy craft built for endurance and battling the relentless current. It was larger than anything we'd seen from the island before, certainly bigger than the old ferries that used to bring tourists here in safer times. Whoever was on board had come prepared for trouble. The deck bristled with equipment, and I could see figures moving quickly, methodically, working against the storm to secure the boat's path to shore. We watched in silence, our breath fogging up the glass as we tracked the vessel's slow, steady approach. But as the boat drew nearer, reality crept back in. The infected weren't slowing, weren't distracted by the sight. Their single-minded focus was on us, the living souls huddled in the statue's crown, and nothing. Not the storm, not the cold, not even the threat of falling into the ocean below, could stop their ascent. "We don't have much time," Leah whispered, her voice tense. Marco nodded. "We need to signal them. Let them know we're up here, that we're..." His voice trailed off, a grim realization flickering in his eyes. "We're sitting ducks up here. They need to know that..." A flash of lightning lit up the room, illuminating the horde below and the approaching boat in one blinding, eerie instant. The infected were almost at the crown, their bodies piling up, desperate to reach us, to claw their way through anything that stood between them and us. "Flare," Marco muttered, his eyes darting around. "They need to see us. They might not know we're even alive." I racked my brain, searching for anything we could use, but supplies were low, far lower than we'd admitted to ourselves over the last few days. The idea of rationing had become almost meaningless. All we had left was the bare minimum, enough to scrape by. Then Leah pulled out her pack and rifled through it, her fingers closing around a battered flashlight. "It's not much," she said, her voice grim, "but it's something. Maybe they'll catch it if we flash it at the right angle." We crowded around the window, working quickly, taking turns holding the flashlight steady, pointing it in the direction of the boat, then flicking it on and off in rapid, frantic bursts. The light was weak, barely a pinprick against the storm, but it was all we had. Minutes passed, each one feeling longer than the last, as we watched the boat inch closer. And then, in a moment that felt like a small miracle, we saw one of the figures on board pause, raising a hand to their brow, squinting in our direction. I held my breath, willing them to understand, to see us not as an obstacle but as survivors, desperately in need of rescue. But just as a sense of hope began to creep in, there was a thunderous crash below. The infected had finally reached the top of the stairwell, pushing their way through, filling the room with a sickening wave of decay and desperation. There was no time left to strategize. We were out of options, out of space, out of hope. "Hold the line," Marco shouted, stepping in front. His voice filled with the kind of steely resolve that made even the most hardened soldier believe in something, even for just a second. We braced ourselves, ready to fight off the swarm with everything we had. But the infected pressed closer, their twisted bodies relentless, a tidal wave of flesh and fury. I swung wildly, the makeshift weapon in my hand colliding again and again, each strike draining my energy, each impact a reminder that we were on borrowed time. Outside, the boat continued its approach, inching closer to the base of the statue, its headlights piercing through the dark. But here, in the narrow space of the crown, there was no room for relief, only a relentless push against the onslaught, every second a fight for survival. And then, through the chaos, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The infected weren't just climbing the stairs. They were starting to reach up, pulling themselves through the narrow windows of the crown, their arms flailing, searching for any scrap of purchase. It was a coordinated movement, a level of determination and sheer willpower I hadn't thought they were capable of. These weren't mindless creatures. They were something more, something worse. With a final, desperate shout, I pushed forward, throwing myself into the fray, determined to hold them off, to keep that last shred of hope alive, no matter what it took. The fight wasn't over, not yet, and as long as there was breath left in my body, I would keep going, keep fighting, keep hoping for a way out. The infected poured through the windows, their limbs twisting and contorting as they squeezed into the narrow confines of the statue's crown. It was horrifying, watching their broken bodies force themselves through impossible angles, indifferent to pain or resistance. We backed into each other, forming a tight circle, our weapons raised, but the truth was stark. We were cornered. Marco shouted over the groans and crashes, "We have to get down. If we stay here, we're done for." The path down meant pushing through them, a mad dash along the narrow staircase that spiraled all the way to the base. Leah looked pale, her face drawn, but she nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. One by one, we dropped into the stairwell, forced to move in a single file with no room to turn, only able to see what was immediately ahead or behind us. The narrowness worked both ways. Our tight formation kept us safe, but we had no margin for error. Every movement counted. Every stumble, every breath was the difference between survival and the swarm closing in on us. I led the way, Marco right behind, Leah bringing up the rear, her flashlight guiding us through the darkness. The infected reached from behind, their claw-like hands swiping through the air, scraping against the metal walls as they pursued us. Each step was a countdown, a dwindling hope with every footfall echoing through the stairwell. Then we heard it, a dull thud, then another, the sound of metal, like something banging against the side of the statue. I stopped mid-step, the noise jolting me. Marco hissed, "Keep moving. They're getting close." But I held up a hand. "No, listen." There it was again, and again. Rhythmic, purposeful. Someone, or something was banging from outside, just below us, as if trying to make contact, signaling. We had nothing to lose, so I shouted out, hoping the storm wouldn't drown my voice. "We're here, inside the stairwell. Help us." The banging stopped. A second later, a piercing beam of light broke through the darkness from outside, scanning the side of the statue, stopping right near where we huddled. In that instant, I realized someone from the boat had reached the statue. They were signaling to us, but they hadn't found a way in. I looked at Marco. They're right outside, If we can just make it down to the base." He cut me off with a grim nod. "Then let's not waste any time." As we moved, the walls seemed to close in, the sound of the infected above us mixing with the frantic pounding of our own footsteps. The air was thick with tension, sweat and rain mingling in a cold dampness that clung to our skin. But the light outside was a lifeline, a desperate, final chance to escape the nightmare we'd been trapped in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the stairwell opened into the lower level. I could see the boat crew just a few yards away, standing on a ledge, their faces twisted in horror as they watched the infected still clawing at the statue's windows above us. Leah let out a sob of relief, but there was no time to celebrate. The crew tossed a rope ladder toward us, yelling for us to climb aboard quickly. Marco grabbed it first, steadying it for Leah as she scrambled across. She was halfway down when I felt something cold and grasping around my ankle. One of the infected had followed us down, close enough to reach me with skeletal fingers. It was ferocious, its grip iron-strong despite its rotting appearance. I kicked, trying to shake it loose, but it clung on, relentless. Marco spun around, his eyes wide with urgency. "Take my hand." He extended his arm, but I was too off balance, too locked in the struggle. The infected lunged, teeth snapping inches from my leg, its guttural growls rattling through my core. Summoning every ounce of strength, I drove my foot into its face, finally breaking its grip. Without looking back, I threw myself onto the ladder, climbing down as fast as I could. The rain hammered against me, each rung slick and treacherous, but the sight of the boat, of salvation just feet below, pushed me onward. As my feet hit the deck, I barely had time to catch my breath before the crew hoisted the ladder up, pulling Marco and Leah to safety. We stared back at the statue, now completely overrun. A twisted symbol of hope turned into a fortress of the infected. They poured from every opening, a flood of contorted bodies, reaching, stretching toward us with lifeless eyes. The captain barked orders to push off, and the boat lurched forward, the engine roaring as we began to pull away from the island. The distance grew, but the image of the statue, once so mighty, now a horrifying monument to all we'd endured, remained burned in my mind. For a moment, silence fell over us. No one spoke. No one looked at each other. We were battered, broken, our minds reeling from the impossible journey we'd just survived. But we were alive. As the boat cut through the choppy water, the city skyline emerged from the mist and rain. New York looked like a wasteland, just shadows and shattered buildings stretching across the horizon. The streets were dark, and not a single light flickered in any building. The only glow came from the lightning, illuminating the world in brief, unsettling flashes. It was hard to tell where the city ended and the infected began. We were all soaked, shivering, and silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The captain steered us around debris floating in the water, an overturned lifeboat, a smashed wooden crate, remnants of past escapes that hadn't ended as well. I looked over at Leah and Marco. They stared blankly, eyes hollow, as if what they'd seen on the island had broken something deep inside. I felt it too, that weight, that knowledge that, even though we had escaped, the infected would always be there, waiting. The boat's radio crackled to life, a brief burst of static that jolted us. The captain leaned in, twisting the dial, and finally, a voice came through. A voice alive with desperation and panic. "All units, coastline is compromised. Repeat, the coast is no longer secure. Evacuate inland immediately. We all looked at each other, dread pooling in our stomachs. Leah's voice was barely above a whisper. If they're saying the coast is compromised, where are we supposed to go? No one answered. We all knew what it meant. The infection had spread further, faster than anyone could have expected. Our journey to the mainland was no longer a guarantee of safety. It was just the beginning of another escape. As we approached the dock, I could see the infected scattered along the shoreline, clawing at the barricades that someone, probably long gone, had set up as a last-ditch defense. The infected seemed endless. A sea of twisted, hungry faces turned our way, sensing fresh movement. The captain cut the engine, letting the boat drift to a slow stop. He turned to us, his face grim. Listen, we have two choices. We can try to make it through them, fight our way back inland, or we can head further up the coast. There's talk of a small community, well hidden, further north. Might be safer than here. Leah looked up, hope sparking in her tired eyes. A community? You think it's real? Marco shook his head. We've been hearing rumors like that for months. Every one of them has turned out to be a trap or worse. But if we stay here, we'll be overrun within the hour. I felt the weight of the choice press down on me. To trust the rumors, to chase yet another fragile hope, or to fight our way inland, facing whatever horror waited on the other side of those barricades. I say we try for the coast, I said finally, my voice steady even as my mind screamed against it. If there's any chance of finding safety, even just for a few more days, we have to take it. The captain nodded, and with a grim determination, he steered the boat back into open water, away from the city that had been our home, now just a memory drowning in shadow. We pushed on through the storm, the waves crashing against the boat, each one a reminder of the turmoil that was now our lives. Hours passed, the coastline slipping by in a blur of twisted metal, abandoned towns, and debris scattered like the remains of a battle that humanity had already lost. The storm hadn't let up, and by the time we reached the northern stretch of the coast, we were all beyond exhaustion. The boat had become nothing more than a small refuge against the elements. The sound of the wind howling, the rain stinging our skin. We hadn't spoken much in hours. Words felt pointless now. What could we say? That we were tired of running? That we were looking for a place that no longer existed? The captain's expression was fixed, but his eyes betrayed him. He had seen what we had seen. The endless stretch of coastline, the decay, the hollow spaces where cities used to be, and the dark shapes that moved within the ruins. There was no escaping the fact that the infected weren't just a threat. They were a new reality. We passed through small, broken-down harbors, half-sunken ships, and abandoned docks. There were no survivors, no safe places, just the signs of lives interrupted, plans abandoned. There's no one left, is there? Marco said, breaking the silence. His voice was flat, devoid of hope, and I could see Leah tense up beside me, the question hanging in the air like a stench. No, I replied softly. No one. We all looked forward, the murky water ahead swallowing our reflections, mirroring the hopelessness we felt in the pit of our stomachs. There were no more answers to find, just survival. As we approached a rocky inlet, the captain slowed the boat, scanning the shore for any sign of life. The shoreline was empty, eerily quiet. No infected in sight, but that didn't mean anything. The lack of activity was as terrifying as seeing them charge at us in full force. Then, a small glimmer caught my eye, a faint light far off in the distance, past the rocky outcrop. A beacon? A signal? Couldn't be sure. but it was something. "We head that way," I ordered, surprising myself with how clear my voice sounded. I wasn't just following instinct anymore. There was a purpose to my words, a hope thin and fragile that maybe, just maybe, this was the place we had been searching for. As we drew closer, I could see the shape more clearly now. It was a small compound, an old military installation, long abandoned but somehow still intact. The walls were weathered, but there was something about it that felt off. It was too quiet. The air around it didn't seem right. "We're here," Leah whispered. It almost felt like a prayer. We docked in silence. No one spoke as we climbed out of the boat and stepped onto the rough terrain, our shoes crunching on the gravel. I looked up at the compound, its rusty metal doors hanging ajar like some kind of twisted invitation. There was no one outside, no signs of life, just a wind that seemed to whisper secrets as it slipped through the cracks of the old walls. A part of me wanted to turn around, to get back on the boat, to sail away and keep looking for a safer place. But that was the thing. There was nowhere else to go. We stepped into the compound, the eerie stillness pressing down on us. We moved cautiously, checking each corner, each door. The place seemed abandoned. Everything was covered in dust, like no one had touched it for years. But then I heard it, a soft sound, the faintest shuffle. We froze. I could feel my heartbeat accelerate. Leah looked at me, fear in her eyes. Marco's hand gripped the small rifle he had salvaged, his knuckles white. From the darkness ahead, a figure emerged. At first, I thought it was one of us, someone from our group who had somehow survived. But then the figure stumbled forward, its body twisted in an unnatural way. It was one of them, a creature not fully human, dragging itself toward us. And then there was another, and another. It was too late. There was nowhere left to run. We had come this far, only to find ourselves trapped again. I knew what we had to do, the same thing we'd done all along. Fight, endure, survive until the very last breath. But as we gathered ourselves for the final push, something in my gut twisted. The infected didn't seem like the only danger anymore. The compound felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. It was as though the darkness here had a life of its own, waiting for us to enter, knowing we would come. And then, the infected reached us in a rush, and the rest became a blur. There was no more time for second guesses, no more hope, just survival. I don't know how long we fought. I don't know if we even made it past the first wave. All I know is that, in the end, it didn't matter. The world had changed, and we were left to wander in its wake. The last day at the Statue of Liberty had come and gone, and with it, so had the last hope of humanity.